like I said, if I can get settled in my place and I get that worry off my mind, I don't mind doing this, a couple of more sessions. I'll certainly do one as discussed last week, but it's really up to you, you guys, I can, certainly go with wherever the flow is, so to speak. Yeah. So anyway, well, you're not missing anything in the city, Richard. It's very hot and humid here, to put it mildly. Yeah. And, yeah. So,
I didn't bring my umbrella.
oh, you didn't? You forgot it again?
I left it in the, no, I left it at home.
Oh, you left it instead of forgot it. Okay, good.
Right.
Good, good. Well, that's better. Yeah.
That's a relief.
Yes. Right. So, I mean, I'll kind of do maybe a couple of just individual remarks to some of the people's concerns. Andrew, I was going to suggest, if you know the work of Merleau-Ponty, that he's very good on the lived experience of the body in a book called, you know him? Yes.
Yes.
You know him, good, good.
Yeah, and I think I'm particularly interested in the late work.
Yes, the visible and the invisible, and works of that note. Those are basically working notes that, by the way, were incredibly influential on the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. Very, very influential on that work, the invisible and
of Lacan,
invisible. So, yes, and I mean, really, in a way, I have a feeling, and I've never seen a dissertation on this. I've seen some remarks. I think Alan Weiss was one person that worked on this a little bit, but there is a very strong relationship to Lacanian ontology and Merleau-Ponty's visible and invisible. And he's really borrowing during that period. There is a kind of shift, if you will, from the clinical, seminars, through seminar 10 into the four fundamental concepts. And
I see.
My this is my speculation, but I think it's a fairly interesting speculation that one could, run with a little bit. Yeah.
That might connect some threads for me.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. Okay. So there are two more people in the waiting room. I'll just wait a couple of minutes and then we'll go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Leslie's here. Hello, Leslie. Yeah. Good to see you. Good. Yeah. Can't see everybody else, but I see they're here.
Michael, can I say that I was happy to receive your email this morning because I really was having questions around Stiegler's concept of proletarianization relative to the proletariat of Marx.
Can you just speak a little louder? I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was really having questions precisely around Stiegler's conception of proletarianization.
Right.
And also, his, as he said, he's Marxian but not Marxist, and I'm curious about those.
Right. Well, there's an extension of Marx in Stiegler, but not really ultimately is he part of the, quote, the dominant Marxist tradition that we're certainly accustomed to. And maybe I'll make some remarks on that. Yeah. I mean, these are extremely deep questions that we could problematize for, 14 weeks easily. But I hope at least we, have some good, sketches, if you will. Yeah. So, So Hugo's here. I'm going to wait before he asks a question or makes a statement. Good. Okay.
No major question yet.
No major questions. Okay. All right. So, maybe first I would address this, and we can come back around because I'm planning to do something, much more substantial. I mean, Will Stradu is here, in the box. Anyway, he has emailed me to a degree to tell me, yeah, there he is, to ask about the relationship, very serious questions, about Stiegler and some of the stuff we did last week on pages 39 to 42, the end of the reading of the first section of The Lost Spirit of Capitalism. So I would like to maybe start tonight about this notion of proletarianization in a general way, right? And talk about this, what Stiegler is trying to do. Whether or not we agree with him or not is another story. I mean, I thought Dennis Bro, who I don't think is coming tonight, is a bit orthodox in saying why make that term up. I think he's doing that to talk about the new kind of labor. This is the labor question for him. First and foremost, if we want to relate to it and maybe begin there, this is really a labor question for Stiegler. And the proletarianization, as I had mentioned early on, really had to do with, the inability of the decadence, what he calls the decadence of industrial societies. No longer do people really make things. It's basically the machine, the automated system that is really doing the making. So he's lamenting this and bemoaning this at one level, this loss of techne, loss of craft, loss of artisanal culture. But at the same time, he's trying to link this not only to this inability to make, but this inability to live, that the two are always in this dialectical movement, right? Which it seems to me, you never really got an extension in Marx. Of course, Marx is hinting at this, throughout when his studies in alienation and of course, in alienated labor. And really when we still talk about selling labor power too, into the marketplace, most people think you're just, you're just getting a job or you're getting employed, but you're really basically selling labor power, one of Marx's great insights in a labor ontology. But for Stiegler, it's an interconnectedness, if you will, between this inability to really make and understand how things are made, which is a byproduct of what he calls the decadence, if you will, of industrial societies. Also, in that moment, and going to the reading from tonight, it is also connected to this immaturity, this inability to become sovereign or to become independent, if you will, or autonomous, which was one of the Kantian goals towards maturity. So he's also trying to relate this to it, as he goes into this thing of the new stupidity, if we want to call it that, or we can use other terms, of course, but he is going to use stupidity. Out of that, he uses the French term bestiality, and la bêtise, which can have positive connotations too, depending on who you're talking to. So anyway, going back to this, so the issue here for him is that he is really talking about consumption as well. That really what's been created in this proletarianization of the world, if you will, or this new proletariat that does not really know how to make, in the ability not to live, that has become just a consumptive object, or an object, that is only a consumer, right? He's really trying to show how the consumer culture becomes so dominant, and how it constitutes us. So we consume books, we don't really produce, we don't really overwrite when we're doing it, right, etc. The culture of almost everything is this culture now of consumption, according to Stiegler. This is the dialectic he's setting up. And that Marx was unable, so to speak, this is Stiegler speaking, not me, but I have some agreement with this, that Marx was unable to see beyond just the fetish of the commodity and did not see how it fed fantasy. He takes this to the psychoanalytic dimension, that the consumer lives through fantasy. He lives through, this kind of world of imagined objects, this world of, only if I have. So obviously Stiegler is taking into account, Bernays, Edward Bernays, we spoke to this a little bit last week, but Bernays' notions of propaganda, how public relations, how you sell, and you use psychoanalysis to do so. But Stiegler is also going to take on this in a sense where he says drive theory isn't enough in psychoanalysis, right, to really understand, the devastation of what is happening to the consumer or to the human in this concept. So he's really talking also beyond, if you will, the psychoanalytic theory of drives, right? And he's, I think, in some ways trying to lead up to, if you want to use this word symbolic, and I'm not so sure he borrows this totally from Lacan. I mean, it certainly resonates, the symbolic order, but again, we have to be careful in the distinctions in the use of language. But in his case, what this new proletarianization of the proletariat is not really just an alienated subject, but is a subject that is desubjectified, that is basically, de-individuated, and then ultimately, just a part of something he calls symbolic misery. That there's a general, beyond that of malaise, a misery, a depression, if you will, that is constantly there, constantly there, that this becomes the culture itself, right? That is going on. So in this way of not being conscious of this, and Marx could not have foreseen this, because what's happening is fantasy gratification at the level of consumerism, right? And not a confrontation of how things are made or how alienated we are in making these products, or participating in automating, automation, or in, going back to Fordism and even post-Fordism. So keep in mind, too, he's also speaking here to the concept of cognitive capitalism, too. What is happening in terms of the general intellect, which is a term of Marx, a great term of Marx in the Grundrisse, and also what is happening in that domain, too. Are people really experiencing alienation still, right? Do they really understand, if we open the computer, are we going back to think about the chips that make it, the labor that goes into it? Do we really constitute our objects of everyday life this way anymore? Or are we just, taking them for granted, and they're making us, if you will, right? This is another thing I think he's speaking to. So again, I think he's, in one way, to the original question that's been kind of posed here, is he an extension of Marx? Yes, in many ways, but he doesn't think Marx has enough firepower, if you will, or has enough, going at this point in the age of finance capital, right? Financialization, in the age of this kind of new mythic Federal Reserve, that you can print money and create liquidity, interventions anytime the stock market goes down. So I think he's really trying to, again, build something completely, beyond, if you will, to use a phrase of Istvan Mazaros, beyond Marx in some ways, to understand our relationships now to capital, right, and where we are with capital. And he uses this word spirit again too as a both one way of looking at it, how it completely lost its way, but at the same time he is speaking to that capitalism is not only dispiriting, but has a spirit that he's trying to, again, phenomenologically get to, and to understand. So for I'll just say this. I know this is another level of abstraction, but, it seems to me that where we are, if we kind of look at the last 40 years of neoliberalism, we're really in the age of financialization. There's no question. I don't think anybody but says that. We're not really in, of course, there's still production, consumption, and distribution. We know this. But finance capital has really taken the lead here. It's no longer that you have this kind of ongoing movement, like you did had it in the 20s with monopoly capital, vertical and horizontal trust. Now we live in the age of levels of abstraction with money in the circuit of M prime that, are hitherto unheard of. Marx speaks in chapter 25, if you will, of volume 3 of Capital, of fictitious capital. Well, this section of Marx has been rewritten in the age of the derivative. It seems to me that the circuit we're living in now is, and we have not yet figured it out mathematically or have not really problematized it as such, is the derivative. How does money become so abstracted from its relationship to production? How have we gotten to this level of abstraction? So I think he's aware of this, right? That's what I'm saying. I don't think he has a formula for it or the complete alternative to it, but at least it's underway, if you will. The question is being posed. So I'd be glad to hear from you, but I wanted to kind of begin there. I think this section on supports, also his thing on the critique of political economy, which is of course the pretext for this, is Marx's great critique of political economy that he wrote in 1859, and the real issue there is critique. It's not political economy, that Marx is engaging only. It's the critique of it. Let's lay political economy bare. Ricardo, Smith, and other things. So his new critique of political economy is a critique of Marx, based again on the world of production, that proletarianization has taken place. There is no longer what we would consider production as Marx had it in the 19th century, right? And reading it, this is just Stiegler speaking again. And secondly, that this world of consumption that Marx, knew also well, and he knew the circuits extremely well in the interrelationships, in terms of the use of the Hegelian totality. But according to Stiegler, consumption is not understood to the degree that it feeds fantasy, and how that's working. So I think that's, maybe a good, a kind of a, if you will, introduction or sketch. If you want to make some remarks on this or have some, insights, I mean, please feel free, and then we can go on to other aspects of, his thought. Because I think, again, this book, as I mentioned to you last week, we should read the little first chapter on unreason and the introduction, States of Shock, is very good, because Stiegler is writing. He's no longer writing in the writing in the industrial finance capital epoch, but he's writing under what he calls the hyper industrial post-structuralist epoch, right? This is the insights he's trying to synthesize, if you will, and become an amalgamation to give us new vocabulary for the future. So please, anyone, I'll stop there with this kind of beginning. Yeah. I mean, I suspect everybody's read Postmodern Condition or knows what postmodernism, Jean-Francois Lyotard. Well, he's very close to this book in the sense that he says there's no longer any use value. It's only exchange value, which also feeds this notion of proletarianization, that we don't know how to make for use only, right? And in some ways, it's all based on exchange value and principles. So there is that slippage going on as well. So I'm all ears if you like, if anybody wants to say anything.
I might just add that I have been struggling is probably too strong a word, but just wrestling with Stiegler's kind of concept of cultural transmission and trans-individuation, and there's something about it that seems attached to a form of culture that could be seen to be patriarchal maybe, or attached to a certain kind of order. It just struck me as it's increasing as we're reading more and looking at him more. I don't think I'm seeing that clearly, but it's reading that way to me. And, his stuff about the superego and the university and the loss of knowledge and a kind of rupture between the generations that has taken place in 68 and all this sort of thing. So I'm a little puzzled about what he's driving at, because you could be just inheriting a deeply oppressive culture that is just maintaining a status quo that is oppressive and alienating. And yet he does seem to want to say that we've broken this kind of possibility of trans-individuation. So I guess I'm just kind of saying I'm somewhat unsure exactly how to situate all that.
Okay, maybe we can come back to the whole notion of trans-individuation and de-individuation. I think, again, going back to this notion of culture, he's really mostly interested in, the taking care. This is really a crucial term for him, is to take care of the generations. And his really central problem, if you will, is how do we transmit to the next generation, right? It's really the question of transmission. And he's using this notion, his notion of culture, if you will, is what we spoke to last week of tertiary retention, is really what needs to be, quote, salvaged, used, and, brought to the foreground. He's really speaking to this, how memory has been industrialized. What do we take of this in terms of the transmission? So, I mean, I think in some ways it's a very Nietzschean problem, like in The Will to Power. Do we have a principle of selection, and what do we choose, right? But at the same time, it becomes a battle in terms of curriculum developments, what does it mean to be educated? So I think he's raising all those questions. What does it mean to be educated at this point? Again, I think not to make him historicist, but he's trying to contextualize, I think, again, this kind of proletarianization, this process that's going on alongside, the university, right? That no longer really is really about job readiness. That's 90% of the university training today is job readiness. The last thing on education's mind, especially from the top, is to educate anybody, to really lead someone out, or the Socratic dialogue or the dialogics that would be involved in this. And this is coinciding, of course, with what he would call, what you're saying, the impossibility of individuation that could lead to trans-individuation. So try to think of this, in some ways, is that the destruction in terms of psychological language of the psychic individuation, which is part of what we're all kind of going through in terms of our education, that the impossibility of the bridge to more of a collective individuation is not happening. This trans movement, this kind of, transversal, if you will, is not occurring. And he wants to build towards that. This is the whole thing of the intergenerational, the internation, and all of that. And again, it sounds like an advertisement at some levels for the UN of knowledge, right? But, in a way it does. But at the same time, it's a very interesting problematic. I know that, for example, a group I'm associated with, when we did Situations Journal in the beginning, the first question we asked, what is living and what is dead in the work of Karl Marx for our time? You ask this question about memory, right? And, this notion of memory, again, is something that is also very crucial to Stiegler, and this is again, this movement back to Plato, this movement back to, the dialogic, if you will, the anonymic, which is crucial. Yeah, Richard, you wanted to say?
I wanted to get, to your question or about the relation of consumption to fantasy
Right.
in his work.
Right.
And again, I wanted to connect it to this work by Todd McGowan called How to Enjoy What We Do Not Have, where he talks about...
I'm going to send that to my girlfriend anyway. How to enjoy what we do not have. Okay, good. I'm sorry.
Me too.
Right.
But how the idea of the subject of desire being constituted, the objet petit a is constituted by loss. In other words, it's an object that only exists because it's lost.
Right.
It's constituted by loss. Contrast that with the idea of the object in capitalism, the commodity, the fantasy, the fetish that it's going to get you what you want.
Right.
In the constant way, I mean, I can't speak for anyone else, but certainly for myself, you know, the new piece of a camera equipment is going to solve all my problems, and I'm finally going to make Citizen Kane, you know, or whatever. But the way that commodities, you know, elicit certain fantasies, and you know, and then if you think about Freud's misery and melancholia, that you know, or excuse me, mourning and melancholia.
Yeah, the process
mourning,
of mourning. Yeah.
You kind of realize the object is lost, and you get over it. Versus melancholia, which is kind of this constant, ongoing relationship to an object, which is never, you know, fully let go of. So his idea, Stiegler's idea of misery, reminds me of this. In other words, in capitalism, it's just this constant frustration or constant failure of the object, because of course there is no, you know, again, the objet petit a is only constituted through loss, but yet the fantasy within consumerism that, you know, the objects are fulfilling what they evoke. And so this just constant misery. I mean, one of the things that McGowan and Stiegler agree on is the constant, you know, underlying misery that is part of this the fantasy, or coexist with the fantasy of the consumer identity.
Right. I'm just going to make a remark on that, and then we can, you know, discuss more, because there's a lot really out here. One remark I want to make is Stiegler does not think primary or secondary narcissism is enough, you know, to really explain this or get this started. Stiegler has a category that he calls primordial narcissism, right? And what we have lost, this is, and he goes back to Kant for that, is the ability to self-love, auto-affection. You know, not this phony seeing the mirror, but where we've really lost is auto-affection. And this is the product of what you just described, that McGowan, etc., and others have, you know, problematized, and what Stiegler will call ultimately the generalized symbolic misery under which we live. You know, this world of disenchantment, this world of anomie, to use the sociological term of Durkheim. And so I think it's important to think that he is really trying to take another step back phenomenologically, you know, in the method of phenomenology, where one does another regress, right, to another level in order to uncover something else, you know, in terms of the phenomena. So for him, primordial narcissism is the starting point, right? And then what has happened here is that most people, you know, I mean, the 5-year-olds that are taking drugs because the parents aren't there and the kids really don't have relationships to the world, all of these things are, you know, now, you know, part of this, you know, depression, part of this symbolic misery, because they've never learned how to like themselves or how to be affective in the world. So he's really talking about a kind of, I mean, you know, in psychoanalytic vocabulary, and I'm sorry to keep using this, but I think it's relevant, the loss of affect, right? That there's a kind of affectlessness happening, and that both Freud and Lacan, even in the mirror stage, did not see this, you know, specifically enough, right, or sharply enough, is what he's, you know, trying to, you know, without him saying that. I think that's what he's up to uncover something even deeper, if you will, or more hidden. So I think this is, you know, another category of his worth thinking about. Again, try to remember where we began tonight. I mean, Stiegler is about, you know, creating neologisms, but they're very etymologically sound, right? It's not like he's just, you know, out there in rhetorical fantasy land. You know, he's really trying to ground this in a dialogue with the Greek, with the Greek language, the ancient Greek language, very much like Heidegger claimed philosophy must do, to have the path out of where we are, or as at least a starting point. So I'm not so taken aback by, symbolic, as you know, Richard, in Greek, means to come together. The symbolin is you bring together something. This is really what it is. How did something get to be together? So his notion of symbolic misery, is how did this misery come together in this, code that we see all the time out there, or in this, structure. And maybe we could even call it totemic in some ways at this point, in terms of a post-modernity or post-structuralism. So anyway, I want to keep that in mind too. But yeah, but again, it's really this, going back to where we started tonight. This where Andrew started with the proletarianization. I mean, Stiegler is really, he really sees that as a loss, if you will, that has not been mourned yet. This, to put it back into, this Richard's language of McGowan and Lacan, and uh, of the mourning of the object, the loss, is not really taking place, because the consumer is all too ready to fill the moment, right? To fill the void constantly, to fill the void. And as we all know, what is it that lack is, right? Lack is in between desire and need, right? And the more and more that you fill, right, that lack, right, the more and more you get away, if you will, from desire, right? And then you get into a kind of production of needs, and, the planned obsolescence of needs as well. This is capital at work, and it's, I think, in its very interesting way. Yeah, please.
There's an anecdote about the psychoanalyst who has a child. I think this is a story I remember. And it was a child, very wealthy child, who have wealthy family, and had just these piles and piles of toys. And the analyst took them all away, said, take them all away, took them all away. And the kid goes, I want all of them back. And the analyst said, there is no all, And then finally the kid goes, well, I want the little bear who's missing one eye and his arm was kind of bent like that. And that was a way to get the kid back to desire. In other words, to spark the lack, to spark desire, instead of this flooding, just like once upon a time, if I wanted to see a friend would call me and say, oh, they're playing The Shining down on next Thursday, film forum, we can go see it. Now, you can have Prime Video, you can, have it constantly. So there's this lack, if you could say, or there's this lack of, there's a collapse of desire in the midst of this, society, which is all about the object pushing forward, right, and its availability.
Right. I mean, I think in the COVID, the pandemic era that we're entering more and more, I think it's very important to keep this in mind. What is the planned lack going on at this point? What are we really beginning to experience from capital at this point? If we want to consider capital still as the master, and I mean, obviously it is master signifier here, right? That you're, what is this new plan lack? What will this be like in some ways? What's going to be, Phil? We hear this language of defunding police, reform, right? Black Lives Matter, all of these things. You can begin to, group these into, certain categories and think about this. And I'm sure all of you were very impressed with the Biden program to invest in America. We're not going to make it great again, but we're going to invest in it. So, Sleepy Joe is already, or Uncle Joe is already, it's unbelievable how bad this is. I'm sorry, but anyway, and how absurd. But anyway, we've gone from tragedy to farce to pastiche. I don't know where we are now. I mean, in terms of a literary form, how bad it's gotten. But anyway, to return to this, this is very serious business because we're obviously in this moment of where capital will frame some kind of new plan lack, and you can see it at work. No school, or go to school regardless of anything. What is really going on here in terms of this movement of desire, lack, and need, and how is this lack again being filled by the system? And I think this is what Stiegler's speaking to as well, that how does the fantasy become not only generated, but how does it keep it going on? As we all know, Marx in Fetishism of Commodities is very well aware of that fetish means to give magical properties to something, right? It is part of a fantasy, the commodity. Marx certainly understood that and tried to demystify it in terms of, but I think what Stiegler's talking about is really the game of making something very quickly obsolescence, the inability to mourn the loss, right? As you pointed out in this story of the child psychoanalyst, taking all the toys away and then saying there's no all, there's only a partial drive, right? In a sense, which is what the analyst demonstrates to me is that there's no such thing as the totality ultimately. There's only a pars totalitas always at work. We constitute around totalities, but there's always that part or I think it's interesting to think about it this way too, when we begin to talk about this era of consumption, right? What is going on? And I mean, again, he is really proposing, my friend and some of you here today, friend Stanley Aronowitz, proposing a kind of a new industrial, moment, right? This is why he doesn't want to get into the language that we're outside of the new industrial era, or, he wants to use this thing, hyper industrialization, because he wants a plan. For industrialization, a new kind of industrial policy, if you will, in this age as well. So I think this is important to remember. This is about infrastructure too, material infrastructure as well as psychic materiality and psychic material infrastructure. So I think this is where he's going. I mean, and in a way, look, again, he is not a Marxist. No. I mean, and Josh will attest to this. Josh already told me this guy's justifying capitalism, but I'm not positive about the justification of capitalism. But he is looking, if you will, for a new industrial spirit, if you will, that is also connected to an Enlightenment project or a project of maturity. This is kind of the combination of the political economy of the moment, or the economic, the psychic, right, and the going back to what Hugo mentioned in the beginning, this process of transindividuation, in another way. Yeah. So I'm just yeah.
The last time she doesn't have her name there, so I can't recall her name, but talked about Kristeva last time.
Lydia, she's here.
Yeah, I see her. I just don't see her.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
But also, in terms of this relation of fantasy, the idea of the objet petita, and that objects not ever fulfilling, they're never the object they're supposed to be. It, in this misery, it also creates a particular kind of violence, material coming, I don't know if this is a fake etymology, but from mater, the mother or the relation, but this incredible kind of violence towards the material world, again, climate change, this thing of the privatization of wealth and making public of cost and everything. That within this fantasy relationship to material objects, in the misery they also create a society which is at the same time has this kind of very violent relationship to the environment.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is, I mean, this is Heidegger and the Frankfurt School in their base, right? I mean, in a sense that since the Cartesian moment, we have put ourselves in this position of being lords or domination of nature. And of course, the feminists have taken this up in terms of, domination of the Mother Earth, all of these kind of moments that have gone on since then. And of course, Heidegger, is basically saying that we've just he takes it to the extremes, as you know, where he says the agricultural combines are just as bad, if not worse, than the camps were. Of course, Marcuse wouldn't talk to him after that letter, but, he did say this, that the rape of the land, right? The rape of the, Rhine River, the valley, and the Danube is enough to, make him say this is what we've become in terms of this metaphysical, if you will, sending, in many ways. So this has always been, the domination of nature thesis that was out there from the Frankfurt School, that took its point of departure from Heidegger's question concerning technology, poetry, language, thought, all of these, essays that really thought thinking, must be, quote, I'm using the term here. I mean, Heidegger never used it, but it was used in like a talk about Heidegger when it first came, a kind of feminization of thought, right? That the masculinist tendency here was to dominate, right? To dominate nature.
Mm-hmm.
And what is Trump exemplary of? We're back to nuclear weapons, We'll show the rest of the world. I don't know if you know the Randy Newman song, Political Science, but we'll drop the big one now, right? Is really the attitude that, we're getting. So that we're living through this incredibly reactionary period, right? Towards, something that opened up completely different, the possibility of the non-domination of nature and, kind of thinking of us as, Spinozist as part of, right, in a way, as Marx did too, even though Marx in terms of labor, and he's been criticized for this, I know John Bellamy Foster and others try to, rescue Marx from this, but, Marx has always taught labor is transformation of nature and at times is domination of nature. Yeah,
Yes,
right, in a way.
absolutely.
Yeah. So again, the proletarianization can lead to this. So I think these are very, very complex
Exactly,
questions,
complex.
and as we go forward, and um, but I think that again, Stiegler's, I mean, at least to my mind, is the one that has kind of worked through, if you will, and if you see this in states of, shock in the beginning, the notion of unreason, right? And he's working through all the philosophers of whom, the French held on high after the generation of Sartre, Lacan, the generation of the late 20s and 30s, who passed away, into the generation of Deleuze, Foucault, and Althusser and others, and Derrida, of course. So he's really trying to work through those moments. And again, let me just say another thing about proletarianization. And again, it's complicated, and I hope next week we'll go back and maybe give more definition, and we could continue. But the grammatization he's talking about too, this being written, is also happening simultaneously with this proletarianization of the world, right? This inability to make anymore, right? We're being written in the cyberspace. We're being written through cybernetics in some ways. So he's also looking at that too, that we become objects, this way. So yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think this is important to keep in mind. So he takes this from Derrida. It's not just grammatology, right? The study of writing or the privileging in the Western tradition of speech over writing, and it's time to get back to what was marginalized from the text, and to return to that, and study the metaphoric, the metonymy, and study it from the position, of, woman, marginalized, being, slave society, all these kind of things, but to try to understand this as processes of an era of grammatization. So he's going to go through this too, through gesture and speech, all the way up to the machinic language of our day in many ways. And this is Epimetheus. Epimetheus also leads to my thesis, to learn, right? The epi is also learning of the epiphenomena etymologically. So I think this is also interesting that he chooses this myth to work with as techniques. So anyway, I'll stop there. So
I was just
yeah.
thinking that, in the pharmacology, I
I'm sorry.
don't think that Stiegler is siding, if you will, with speech, so to speak, over writing. I think actually he's,
no.
I don't know if he's siding with writing, but he is recognizing writing as techne as a kind of historical inevitability that
Yes.
we have inherited, and
Right.
it has historically taken different forms as we've become more technologically complex, I guess. But in fact, I don't know if he shares exactly Derrida's suspicion of notions of presence and origin in speech, because that was Derrida's critique of Husserl in a sense, that this is kind of not really a thing, that it is it itself is a kind of fantasy construction. And it may be Stiegler's more of a, I don't know, historical realist or something, in the sense that he is accepting of writing, but yet we find ourselves in a certain predicament with it. Mm-hmm. And that's our pharmacosis, that we are it's still not clear to me whether the way out is through some dialectical process or revolutionary process, or because it seems like he's saying we're at an impasse and there's a kind of death drive operating, and that's it. We're just grinding to a halt.
Well, I mean, I think he's problematizing the aporia and revolutionary. There are dialectics and revolutions. I mean, dialectics is always there. I mean, at least for these thinkers, in a sense. What they're really trying to do at all costs is avoid a kind of positivism, right? And in that way, they're always trying to avoid that. And this is something that's very crucial to all these thinkers that are engaged, from Deleuze to Derrida to, to Foucault, to others that he engages, and particularly the Frankfurt School, So again, I mean, I think he's really trying to say, yes, this is the aporia where we are. This is the conundrum that we're in, and part of that conundrum is this notion of the pharmacon as both being poison and remedy. And in terms of Heidegger, Heidegger said technology will reveal in its greatest dangers its liberating potential. What that means is beyond, I mean, we can't really sit here and say he actually meant this, but maybe it would show itself. This is what he's, trying to say, that this is a revelation or an unconcealment of something historically that has gone on that would catch us unaware of where we really do have the liberating potential. So, I mean, if we take an example like social media and what it did in Tahrir Square, what it does with Black Lives Matter, what videos of these things do, is that part of a literary potential, or is that something that's just feeding, again, a new kind of dress rehearsal for surveillance state? Or is it a combination of both? How do we really look at this? Yes, I mean, this is our question. And I think we're so accustomed in some ways to think in either or and multiple choice and all these things that we're through everyday life, as well as the schools, that we forget the both and. It doesn't have to be either Marx or not, right? Why not both Marx and some of the insights of post-structuralism, or both Marx and some of the insights of postmodern technology. What could we do at this point? I mean, where are we in a way? Just like politics too. And I mean, you can see the fear out there. I mean, to me, this is a gauge what's going on in the Democratic National Committee. I mean, I've never been a Democrat since 1968. I mean, I've finished when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. I mean, this was the end to me of the Democratic Party when they, put up Hubert Humphrey, and they've never recovered from that moment. And but anyway, all to say, and I never was a voter in the but I probably would have voted for Bobby Kennedy when I was very young. I don't know if I was voted close to voting age, but all to say, look at where we are, how threatened they are about the status quo being, upended, even a little bit, even a modicum by Bernie Sanders, who's basically harmless in my view to people that are really thinking. I mean, they're even afraid to incorporate some of his principles, and his, program into their platform. So I think this is very important to keep in mind as we go forward. What is it about the power of thought and this power of thinking in terms of both and, like the pharmacon? Yes, there's a poison out there, but there's a remedy. Does COVID-19 and all this isolation have some kind of really positive element in terms of building community, building revolutionary consciousness, building, a new way of relating of human beings? I don't know. I'm like Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. But Romain Rolland, who actually was the first to say that. But this is where I think he's going. And since you brought up, we're at this impasse, this conundrum, this moment. It's not the either or. It's not either speech nor writing either. Yeah, in a way. Yeah. I mean, the person that goes in on the couch, or the person that is, in an active therapeutic condition, is not writing out their case history right there. They're not, even though they are writing it in their head, but it's the speaking subject, is really the stake there. And as Richard, I mean, Lacan, the speech is always privileged, the oral, right? And
right.
and this is someone that did not write for a public, Jacques Lacan. He believed in this oral delivery, which he got from,
Yes.
I don't know if any of you read Alexander Kojet's great lectures on Hegel, but, this was an oral tradition of which a lot of these great French people came up on, the magnificent oral ability. I think I told you the story of Aaron Gurvich at the New School, who wrote a book on phenomenological psychology. He just came in and he'd lecture and he would say, "Ladies and gentlemen, there will be no questions." Right? And he would go. Someone dared to ask a question. No questions were ever asked again after that poor guy dared to ask a question of Gurvich. I'm not saying this is good policy, but in a way, this speaking subject, this great ability to do this, was very much of the tradition. Yeah, in a way. Yeah.
And they found that also in the African tradition,
Yes.
of orality. That was part of their link to the anti-colonials movements.
Sure.
Were also, they felt this affinity with the orality, oral transmission within African cultures.
Yes. So Anyway, maybe what we could do is maybe take a look. Maybe, I mean, if you had any questions or thoughts, I don't know if you had time to read it, but the section of the introduction to states of shock is really, I thought, quite good, in a way. Again, he takes his title from Naomi Klein's book called The Shock Doctrine, in which he uses the term disaster capitalism. It's associated with her, but it really comes from, basically Alan Greenspan and the Chicago School,
Right.
as we all know, has ruined South America from day one. I mean, post 1960s, after the election of Allende in Chile, and then this assassination, the Chicago boys went in right away and I've been binging on a couple of the better. The Ungovernable is the Mexican Netflix thing that I like very much, which is about the narco, trafficking in Mexico and certain populist heroes and how that undoes itself. But anyway, all to say, without Pinochet, without the disappearance of many leftists in South America, this is, not possible, to have this program, done during the 1970s. So this title is taken from that by Klein and then picked up by Stiegler, who's well aware of what's going on. But it seems to me that he's talking about, again, he goes back to a very critical piece, and this is a very, we can send it out. I can have Matt send it to everybody. What is Enlightenment of Kant? It's a brilliant piece. It's philosophical journalism at its best. Was ist Erklärung, which is a response to Moses Mendelssohn's, piece in the German papers, and they were debating what does it mean to be enlightened. What does it mean? Aufklärung means in German to come to the clearing, right? In a sense, right? Not to the origin, but to the clearing. How does one clear away a real path towards being enlightened? And he talks about this, that really what most people are lazy, cowardly, right? He uses these things. Most people are like sheep, and this gives the reason for a guardian culture. This gives the reason for the culture of experts. So Kant is speaking to the immaturity of, to use Stieglerian terms, the processes of individuation that never really get beyond that of psychic blockage, right? In a sense, because it's much easier to have the therapist to tell you what to do, which is really the life coach and not the therapist, right? It's much easier for the financial expert to tell you, quote, what to do with your money, for then you to think about it yourself. It's much easier for you to go to all the specialists or the cult of the experts than to realize your own autonomy. So we have become this society of, where we're totally dependent, right, on, quote, experts, right, in many ways. And I see this personally in my own experience with unions. I see this, constantly in terms of everybody is into the contract. Contract unionism is dominant. Business unionism, sweetheart unionism, because nobody can really say, this is ridiculous, let's go on strike. It's ridiculous, let's just take over, right, in a sense, like they've done in certain places. Naomi Klein's husband, Avi Lewis, made a film about this in Argentina, how they take over a factory, yeah. So, and why not, in a sense. And we saw this with Drum in Detroit. So Stiegler is speaking to this lack of courage to be one's own, best guide, right? And this is what education should be, would be this drive towards autonomy. He uses the language of the sovereign, right? He uses the language of the sovereign. Again, there's a kind of return here. I mean, and some of the other people who know this discourse are not here tonight, like Bruno and Arto, but it is a return to the Enlightenment project in some ways, the unfulfilled project of the Enlightenment that he is speaking to here, right? Which was before Marx invented the proletariat, so to speak, right? Before the Industrial Revolution in many ways. So he wants to go on the maieutic, right? And Richard is good on this, on the midwife, right? Which Socrates' mother was. In case you didn't know, Socrates' mother was a practicing midwife. How do you give birth, right, to reason in the midst of all this reason? And again, the pharmakos, the pharmakon, is this model, if you will, for that maieutic, moment, right? Both the remedy and the poison, in many ways. So, and again, I'm reminded, I know that I don't know how many people of you here have read Lacan or know his history a little bit, but one of the reasons he's kicked out of the International Psychoanalytic Association, which is like being blackballed from the Book of the Month Club. But anyway, to some degree. But anyway, I think he's, was the short session. And this was a moment here of really pushing the pharmacon to the limit. You're experiencing that poison at a deep level. You're on your own in this world, etc. Your anxiety is at the highest. You're going to have to deal with it. The therapist isn't going to be there to tell you it's going to be all right, right? Right? In a sense, or Mother Mary comes to me in times of wisdom and says, "Let it be." That's not really what it's about in that case. So I think Stiegler is working with this in a very good way. So he actually then, going back to where Hugo was speaking earlier, the culture industry, and I don't know, please inform me if you have background or don't, and I'll try to explicate this, but the Frankfurt School, the culture industry itself, right, is a term that they use, right? This is Adorno and Horkheimer at their very best in some ways. These are, in case you don't know, the Frankfurt School was a group of German Jewish intellectuals who ended up in the United States. It basically was a school, an alternative institute of research funded by a Jewish merchant named Heinrich Weil, Felix Weil, the Weil family in Germany, and it was transported to the U.S. Uh, Two members of the Frankfurt School worked for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, against the German war machine. So, this is another moment they were welcomed, right? Even though they were totally subversive, right? And extremely highly educated people. So they came here and they built a name for themselves. And one of the great books is The Dialectic of Enlightenment, right? Going back to where Kant starts. Does the Enlightenment itself, right, really free us? Again, the question of the poison and the remedy, and the both and. Both, can it be a hindrance, right? And can it be a liberation in one? Where do we go with this? It's not especially that you're liberated. This was always, I think, something about Noam Chomsky. Chomsky always thinks that the more you know about the situation, the more prone you are to act. Well, everybody knows this is shit, and we have no action, right? If you really think about this, more and more, the more consciousness we have, it seems that the more the inertia sets in a lot of ways, in some ways, in a lot of ways. It's maybe people without that knowledge, without that consciousness, are the ones that take action spontaneously, etc. So anyway, so Stiegler in this passage is engaging the dialectic of enlightenment, right? Both for and against, right? is Adorno and Horkheimer's position. It's like the anti-Oedipus of Deleuze and Guattari, for Lacan and against Lacan in one, which is again a very complicated matter. Okay, so he talks about this, and if you look at, I don't know if you have you should have had the whole book. I know it was sent out, but on page 6, he talks about the social therapeutics. He has very interesting terminology. Social therapeutics for the shocks caused by technological pharmaca is what politics must prescribe. Right? Social therapeutics. This is one of his notions, right? For a lengthy period of time, this did in fact take place. From the moment that politics became, in the industrial ages of the 19th and 20th century, a political economy that required an overall industrial policy. So he's thinking this through in terms of base and superstructure, to use earlier Marxist language, infrastructure, structural relations as well. But this is no longer the case since the conservative revolution. And the conservative revolution, very important, right? Everybody knows this is not only Ronald Reagan at work. It was also in Germany. You had the first conservative revolution of the 20s, which did include Heidegger, Ernst Junger, Carl Schmitt, and other thinkers, all of first-rank thinking ability, right? So it is therefore a matter of completely rethinking industrial political economy in the hyper-industrial epoch of the 20th century. This is why I propose, and I didn't give you the whole book to read, but it's a very interesting if you will, if you're interested in this, again, I don't know the level of the interest, but if you're interested, this is a great précis, if you will, of what has gone on in French thinking for the last 35, 40 years, right? Since May of 68 and longer, right? So this is why I propose a rethinking of Hegel in chapter 5 and Marx in chapter 6. For those of you, you all have the book. If you're interested in the relationship to Marx, there's a chapter 6 is called Rereading the Grundrisse, which was Marx's notebooks on capital and money that he put together in 1857 and early 1858, which some people consider the foundation for capital. I think it's even more interesting than capital, but that's another long story. And beyond two Marxists and post-structuralist misunderstandings. So if you're interested, I know we didn't read it, so I'd be, really speaking, too out of the loop here. But anyway, he goes through rereading Mastery and Servitude, rereading The Dictatorship of the Proletariat. So, we can certainly thematize around proletarianization and why he's thinking of the proletariat different than Marx. So this is in chapter, I think. The book of the being referenced, Andrew, is States of Shock, Stupidity and Knowledge in the 21st Century. All right, so let me just go on here. So the shock therapies implemented by neoliberalism, so states of shock, again, the shock therapies versus a social therapeutics. This is the way he frames this in terms of a dialectical movement, implemented under the guidance of Friedman, Milton Friedman, whose methods were put to the test in Chile after Allende, we all know this, may have proven their efficacy in the short term, which nevertheless leading in the medium to long term to the contemporary catastrophe. And this is being written after the financial meltdown of 2008, 2009, and also in the wake of Occupy and other things. So just to contextualize it a little more. And it's been installed, and this is very important of his, and this is something that should really be out there in the daily newspapers, the economy of carelessness. This is a way of reaching a much broader audience than just talking about socialism like the Sanders campaign did with all its misunderstandings that went around that. The economy of carelessness. Cares that we really need is the taking care of generations and a new form of an economy of care. And this goes back again to the Heideggerian moment in being and time on the structure of being is really care at its foundation. So this is something I think is very, very important to recognize. Okay, so we're in this suicidal doctrine. And suicidal doctrine is another good phrase to be bringing up in the world today. To have installed an economy of carelessness and neglect. But this has been possible. It is only because the university, and this is very interesting to me, being in the university and having at least initially some faith in its ability to transmit knowledge, not so much anymore. But anyway, because as a project of modernity fundamentally proceeding from the Enlightenment, and again, one way we can look at ourselves and, is through this, what values of the Enlightenment remain with us, and then the Kantian discourse of the conflict of the faculties, where he will return to, have been incapable of thinking shock in general, and the shock that technics always is insofar it is irreducibly pharmacological, this being even more real or true when technics becomes technology. So universities may have not managed to know or do anything about this, but this is less because they have been prevented from doing so or because they have been bought off, even if this has only happened, has also happened, then because their development has been based, the university's development based on something that has remained unthinkable, even repressed. The repression of the role of technics in the constitution of the noetic soul and in general, and in the formation of every form of knowledge, the conditions for the possibility of the production of knowledge. He's very Kantian here, but it's interesting Kantianism. And yeah, that, and the repression in particular, this is very important. I experience this with students all the time, of the role of techniques in theoretical knowledge. The mnemotechnics, that is, writing, is the condition of possibility of reason, of logos, and of its logics as theoremic faculty. Analog and digital mnemotechnology, however, represent a new stage of the process of grammatization, going back to what we were talking about, a process through which alphabetic writing led to the foundation of the polis. So going back to these ages of grammatization, the Greek world is about the alphabetization. This is an earlier thing. Now he's talking about mnemotechnologies, the new stage of the process of grammatization. We're in the third epoch of grammatization, according to Stiegler, in terms of techniques as time. So keep this in mind. You know, I think I presented a little bit to you the first time we met, that the history of being, if you will, you know, the history of ontology, being as value in Marx, being as power in, you know, Nietzsche. These are crucial concepts that have come up. You know, being as desire, you know, in Freud, etc. Well, Stiegler is talking about grammatization as alphabetic script, but now in our epoch as part of the mnemotechnology. Technologies of memory, whether it's hyponymata in the machine, right, or anonymata, which can still be in the head, right? And what is that dialectical tension that is constantly going on, right? And is the remedy in the the anonymesis, the recollection, that he'll go back to the Meno, a Platonic dialogue, or the therapeutic dialogue, such as you know, Freud would enact, you know, in terms of the therapeutic encounter, the dialogue that takes place, the psychoanalytic dialogue. Is this one way out, right? Or how does one write that as well, right? Versus that of, are we fully in this industrialization and cybernation, if you will, of, you know, the memory of the machine, or the industrialization of memory? How do we think this through? So he's looking at this again vis-a-vis culture, going back to where he starts, because you know, and political economy. So digital technology is the new stage of writing. What we're engaged in now. I mean, Zoom, CrowdStrike, all these companies never had it so good. You know, in a way, this is what's happening. You know, software companies, Slack, you know, of course, Microsoft, as we know, all of these moments, right, is the new stage, and thus also of reading, which is interesting. An industrial system founded on the production and the activation of traces, which is a Derridian term, the trace, you know, for those of you that know de la grammatologie, for example, the trace is very crucial, of grammes and graphemes, that discretize, affect, reproduce, and transform every flux and flow well beyond just language. This writing is produced and written, and I think this is very crucial to understand grammatization and its process, is produced and written in silicon with new codes, right? With new codes, right? With new tools, instruments, and devices of publication. And the story must be told from this perspective, from clay and papyrus to today's microelectronic structures and tomorrow's macroelectronic, if not bionic, that encode to silicon the industrial standards we refer to, ASCII, right, XMI, and so on, that scan the algorithms of search engines that automate reading and writing, and that index, tag, and categorize the new meta languages, which all of this presupposes, the totality of which results in generalized traceability and tractability. You know, the new surveillance economy, if you will, but at the same time, what the hyper-industrial leads to. So this is all on pages 6 and 7 about this remedy. This massive and brutal eruption of these new kinds of hyponemata, and I emphasize this term. This is not anemata, hyponemata, right? Radically changes the very conditions of education and research, as well as the relations between educational institutions and universities on the one hand, which has, and what lies outside them on the other. This protean outside is now permanently inside, thanks to computers, mobile phones, but also to those reforms intended to dictate to the academy, in its totality, the non-academic imperatives to which it is now required to submit. Labor-ready education, work-ready education. That's 90% of what people are being taught in the schools today, right? Yeah. These imperatives arise from a technological shock strategy, the result of which is that the conditions of autonomy and heteronomy, of academic institutions in a broad sense, in a sense whereby education and research together form the academic world, the matrix for which takes shape in Athens in the 4th century BCE, finds themselves radically changed. Right? So then he goes with Pierre Macharet, to whom I shall refer later in the work. Pierre Macharet, by the way, was a Marxist literary thinker, was part of the original Reading Capital group with Althusser, Balibar, Roger Stiegler, and Jacques Rancière in 1965, and he wrote a brilliant book called The Theory of Literary Production, and a very good chapter of Lenin reading Edgar Allan Poe. A very interesting attempt to see this happen. Right, anyway, I question the validity of a discourse, and this is interesting, on this hyponemata. Again, and I'm trying to give you something crucial here to work with, if you will, which I find fantastical, premised on the necessity and possibility of resisting by maintaining the illusion of a university without condition. And I'll just say this, Stiegler is also in argument here with, both and argument and agreement at times, with his buddy Jacques Derrida, who wrote a book, an essay called The University Without Alibi, The University Without Conditions, which was a kind of position paper that he developed in terms of the Group for the Research of the Teaching of Philosophy, or known as GREPH, and what became the Collège de Philosophie in Paris. Anyway, I do need autonomy, right? That the university is not, and we know this from Lacan, the 4 discourses, as Richard knows very well, that the discourse of science in the university, are in this tension always, as is analyst and analysant, right? In the 4 conditions, the 4 discourses. And in a way, as a conditional freedom, which is interesting too, as a pharmacology of autonomy under retentional conditions. So this is his way of going back to a new reading of Kant and the theory of Enlightenment for our purposes as we go forward. Retentional conditions, right? Such conditions constitute the conditions, always precarious, never assured, of responsibility, which is another thing that Kant is taking up, a recurring theme in the writings that Derrida devoted to the university. It is clearly Derrida's thinking that possible makes my discourse, which is therefore not an anti-Derridian discourse, but which, if I put it like this, envisions the possibility, and this is interesting too, this is typical of, phenomenology, the deconstruction of deconstruction, right? Or the possibility, the impossibility of possibility. Or, or demand the impossible, which was a great phrase, of course. Be realistic, demand the impossible was Che Guevara, in terms of, guerrilla warfare and, the JQ. So anyway, I don't know if this helps. I mean, I hope it does to to kind of elucidate a little bit of what the program is and how he is in some ways updating things, through social therapeutics and a kind of way of understanding digital technology, alongside anonymous, right? and bringing that back around to the floor, to the fore. And then, of course, he goes on to the section called responsibilities, in which he's going to engage, if you will, the philosophers of the post-structuralist era. Anybody want to say anything before I, go on to a little bit of the sections that he finds the limitations of the Frankfurt School? Again, this book presupposes somewhat some knowledge of the Frankfurt School, etc. Although I think you get the picture through social therapeutics and shock doctrine what he's really trying to do here, and also that the university wants to remain dependent on the outside. The university is no ivory tower. He's looking at, if you will, there's a rewriting here of conflict of the faculties, in which, religion belongs over here, philosophy belongs here, mathematics belongs here, etc. But, ultimately it comes together as the university. So anybody want to say anything to this? I mean, this, again, and the grammatization from the alphabetic speech to digital writing, right? Where we are today. This is another, I think, interesting moment. So again, there's a lot of neologisms here, but at the same time, I think they're very grounded. It's not just a game. It's not a jargon, to my mind. I don't really find this jargon filled. But maybe if he could be critiqued, he's trying to really update some very powerful thinking. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
in this connection, I thought in the Unreasoned chapter of States of Shock, section 14, where he talks about the downgraded generation addresses the lyrical generation. I thought was really interesting because in a way, that's a way to sort of think sociologically, perhaps, in terms of the crisis. And in a way, he's saying that the generation of 68 that became parents cannibalized their own children. And that there's a way in which the children of the generation of 68 who have been cannibalized by their parents have been left in this state of, whether it's anomie or in the state of kind of dependency on the market, dependency on consumerism, because they don't have a sense of themselves in relation to others or history or whatever it might be. So that that was just an interesting critique, and yet at the same time, the children of the generation of 68 who have been cannibalized by their parents are in no position to escape their predicament or resolve their situation, and therefore to affect any kind of change or revolutionary transformation. So it's this kind of double bind of just being stuck within. Now, it led me to wonder, is the generation, the next generation, which you could argue maybe is the...
I've been hearing that from my relatives. Just wait till the next kids are born. Right? It's kind of the
But is there some change, or is it just a continuous chain of, in a way, what he's sort of saying is like infantilization, parents who themselves make it impossible for their children to become adults and use them to advance this kind of late capitalism of consumer objects and the transfer of desire. We've been talking about the transfer of desire into, a sort of inert, stagnant pacification, of desire that doesn't really go anywhere, and all that. But I don't know if there's, if the children of the atomized generation. The children of the 68 generation's children, their children. I don't know if that's if they're Generation Z or millennials or whatever, but maybe are they in the same predicament? You know, the young people that we're teaching today in schools, are they in the same predicament as their parents? I just raised that as a question, but I thought that chapter, that section was really compelling in some ways.
Yeah, it was a good one. Yeah, Andrew. Yeah, please. Yeah. I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Can anybody else hear him or no? Can we? No? Okay. I'm sorry. I thought I was the only one, but yeah. Yeah, we can't hear you yet. Yeah. I know you're not muted, but something's going on with your audio. Yeah. So can you get it on, or now you're muted, Andrew? Now you're not muted, but don't hear you yet.
Try unplugging your headset. Unplug, replug, or just unplug. Oh.
Are you hearing me? No?
Now we are. Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you. Good.
All right, is this okay? So for the moment, I'll just say what was compelling for me in that section was that the children of the generation of 68, there is an undeniable, I mean, one can say that they're sort of, I don't know, they're immobilized, I suppose was Stiegler's point, as was the generation prior to them, right? As was their parents' generation. But what I noted was there was a kind of wokenness, actually, to their predicament. And that was very compelling, you know, their kind of recognition of their impotency, maybe is the word. And I feel like, I don't know, that's a beginning. And I don't know if it's about endlessly deferring to the next generation. You know, I feel like what the children are speaking to is, okay, this is what you've done to us, right? And in a way that's also not, again, stepping into maturity, which is Stiegler's critique, not stepping into maturity, but that's a step in the process. And I think, as you noted earlier, Michael, it's almost like, well, the more you know, the less action you take, in a way. So I want to say maybe that's the impasse. It's like,
right. I mean, if I could just add one thing to this that I thought about a little bit, it seems to me that with the inflation and the way the economy has been since the middle 70s, what's occurred is a more prolonged economic dependency on the family, on the parents in some ways. That this has occurred simultaneously, like when I'm growing up, you get out of the house at 17, 18. You want your own little, you know, $30 to $50 a month apartment. That's an impossibility for so many kids today, unless you're, quote, you know, super rich or, you know, I mean, they have the dorms at the school. So in a way, this kind of prolonged dependency has really also been, you know, created. I just wanted to throw that into the mix as part of the economic reasoning, as well. Yeah.
Question into this.
Yeah.
You know, I've been thinking the whole time, well, people are actually getting out in the streets. You know, some people are beginning to get out in the streets. And I'm curious about what is the connection between the thought and the action? You know, what is the connection between the waking to one's state of subjugation, which I feel like is what the children were speaking to, and actually mobilizing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really. I mean, I just saw that John chatted with Hugo about BLM as being a a moment of the break or the rupture. I'm not really, thinking that way, and at least from my standpoint at this point. But maybe it is an awakening, as you say, that there's a waking up of things. But as a rupture from something, I'm not really sure that this could be talked about as, quote, an event, in a way. I mean, for the notion of event, Badiou is very good on this, locating events in history. For him, the four events are, of course, the French Revolution, the Paris Commune. So you have, 1789, 1871, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And for Badiou, who's a young, very smart man in the 68, thinks May of 68 is. And if you think about May of 68 in Paris, students basically activated the taking down of a government. That the president, think of Donald Trump having to leave the country because he's threatened. Charles de Gaulle had to leave the country. He came back and the police action started, of course, except de Gaulle did say when they tried to arrest Sartre, you don't put Voltaire in jail. Right? I mean, he has at least that much sense about, the French are good at this, and you can, I don't know if you've seen Battle of Algiers, where the colonel, is, speaking about Sartre, if he agrees with Sartre and the respect they have for intellectuals. But all to say, I mean, yes, this may have been a rupture in some ways, but what Stiegler again is doing is looking at this event and saying, yeah, go. I mean, let's suppose this is a moment of awakening. The question is, where does it go? Without this understanding of digital technology, the writing machine, the notion of the general intellect in all of this. So I think these are the important questions as we go forward. I mean, some of you may read, Black Agenda Report, Glenn Ford and Margaret Kimberly and Bruce Dixon. And, they're not, I mean, they're as militantly black as you can be. They're not favorable towards BLM in many ways, right? A lot of people see this as, in a way, another liberal fantasy in some ways. There's playing to that. I don't know. I mean, I haven't really said, but I'd be very interested to hear from other people, because this is something that's coming again from the outside. It's been, prompted by, these vicious police killings, obviously, that have been going on for a very long time. I don't know if you saw the Rich They Are Asleep Gun Club video of Nicky Daniels in Louisiana, where he's asked, why are you carrying weapons? And he answers to the media, why not? And he basically has said to people, don't I have as much a Second Amendment right as that white Confederate gang across the street? So he really took the position of Huey Newton and the Panthers again, that being armed is a way of self-defense. So, I mean, this to me raises a lot of questions, right, in many ways. And I just want to put this in here. To my mind, I'm in real agreement with the proposition of Deleuze. We have to find new weapons. The weapons of the past might not be adequate for the time we have. And I'm talking about, listen, as a, quote, intellectual, quote unquote, new weapons of criticism and criticism of those weapons. And that, to me, is the dialectical tension. So again, for me to fall fully into line with Black Lives Matter as a rupture, as an event, is a difficult, proposition. But I really want to hear from other people. So yeah.
I participated this weekend in a commemoration of the rebellion at Newark, otherwise known as riots.
Yes, I remember.
And the people who were speaking consider themselves to be a continuous with the 1967, 1968 Black Lives Movement. For them, BLM means Black Liberation Movement. And they're speaking with the rhetoric of the Panthers and of a wide-scale liberatory movement that's just as old as anything. Right. And I found it really compelling. And there were people there speaking about, the snipers were children coming through the windows, the rifle shots, and needing to duck down behind couches, and the tanks in the street for 5 days. So I actually felt really encouraged by the radicality of about the possibility of the radicality of this moment through the memory. And for that reason, I do feel encouraged.
So we will baptize you as a Stieglerian. This anonymic memory or mnemotechnics is very powerful in this regard, right? I mean, that is his position in a certain way.
Maybe,
right?
maybe.
Yeah.
I had been feeling a little disappointed that.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
That no, I was feeling disappointed in his sort of glossing over the digital as in any way substantially different from any other kind of technology. So I think that's actually kind of a weakness.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Okay,
Grammatology is not really expanded because it truly is different what we're dealing with now in terms of AI and the engine of capitalism actually being a more directly mind control, knowledge control, etc.
Right.
Not just surveillance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
To me, one of the things about, Freud talks about these 3 narcissistic blows to humanity, Galileo, Darwin, and the unconscious. And, to me, it seems that the model or the concept of the unconscious, which undermines the idea that, that the conscious mind is in this controlling position, also makes one, pessimistic about the ability of those in control to stay in control, because the very control is at least contains within it the possibility. This is not unlike capitalism and the idea of contradictions. So that capitalism will constantly have these moments of crisis, although whether or not they're used to be, as Naomi Klein says, a disaster capitalism, every disaster can be recuperated. But, the technology, just think about logos versus techne and what we're doing here. I mean, this would have been us in one room sitting, and now it's mediated through this technology. Instead of our discussion here is, I can see the button saying recording. It's being recorded. It's being remembered, or recorded, let's say. Yes,
we promise everybody subsidiary rights.
What?
We promised everybody subsidiary rights if these ever become famous. All participants, we'll develop a formula to compensate everybody that's participated. I'm sorry for the recording aspect. Right? Yeah.
And and in terms of this thing about memory, I just, thanks to you, Michael, I've been reading that article that meditation by Nietzsche on history, timely and untimely, if I get the title right, or useful and he talks about, about the importance of forgetting, and this is something that people forget about Freud too. Freud's thing was not just to remember in a sense, but it was also so that you could forget. In other words, that unconsciously, he would say that people would say, in dreams, he says, well, people say, well, why don't you let sleeping dogs lie? He said, well, they're not sleeping. I'm totally for letting them, So part of what, the notion of psychoanalysis is to let people forget, is that they're constantly, they're their machine is constant. They're not aware that the depression is because they're constantly mourning. And the other thing he says that that we are in a position. He says the Greeks knew how to forget. They knew how to remember, but they also knew how to forget. And they said they would have seen us as walking encyclopedias. Now we know that the business of encyclopedias the business of encyclopedias has collapsed because we're all carrying the most incredible encyclopedia in our phone around. So, in terms of you were talking about how the more we know, or the more woke we are, there's a sense in which there's a tremendous passivity, the inability to forget, or that knowledge is not necessarily, more knowledge is not necessarily what we need to elicit action,
No, I mean, good. Just speaking to Nietzsche was against knowing too much. He was against encyclopedic knowledge. This limits us in terms of acting in the world. It actually limits critical faculty. And if anybody's of the body of the modern, philosophical holy trinity, Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, if you will, it's really Nietzsche who's really privileging the body throughout all of this, and in terms of the beginning. I mean, Freud certainly organizes the body into, a very, impressive, or psychic organization. But Nietzsche is the one that really speaks of the body, conscious, and really is against consciousness. So the thing with Stiegler, he remains a phenomenologist. He believes in consciousness. He believes that what I spoke about last week is this network of consciousness. And it's not really about the political or the economic unconscious at all for Stiegler. You have to keep that in mind. It's not really about this, or the social unconscious, or the cultural unconscious for his purposes. Yeah, yeah. So I just want to go to one thing in the chat. Hugo, I agree that Black Lives Matter may not be part of the establishment Democrats, in a sense, but there is a big arguments out there between Adolph Reed and the race theorists too, that it's very important to keep in mind too. That, I mean, as Adolph points out, what's forgotten in all of this is class structure, class relations, and class as a movement. And I think he's very good on this, and it's worth taking that into account too. I know Josh is here. I don't know if he wants to speak to this, but he's been writing a very interesting piece on Black Lives Matter for Situations Manifesto, and I know that he's got thoughts about this. Whether he wants to share them or not is another story. I know I'm putting you on the spot. You can say no, it's not developed enough. I mean, I use that a lot. But,
just the general line of thinking, was of course that in terms of BLM, at least in the mainstream way that we sort of that it's acculturated, is that it's posed in terms of form, and defund the police, without community control, for instance, if we're going to talk in agenda terms, doesn't really do much towards revolution. I mean, revolution and rupture is an overthrowing of the categories, and I don't think that even, anything that's happened in the last several decades, at least, has come close to doing something on that order. And so in that sense, I don't think it's very revolutionary. It would have to be on a much different scale and a much different order. And it would have to be total and worldwide. I mean, those are also the requirements for at least the Marxist revolution, So
yeah, I mean, we're living through, at least in my mind, we live through a very, nothing but a series of reforms that have put us in this position. We really have become a completely reformist culture, and going back to this transmission between generations and where we started this go round of transmission from the generation of 68 to their kids. I mean, in a certain way, it's been probably the most regressive moment in the history of the 20th century. I mean, in so many ways. At least, my parents' generation had the Depression. They could talk about swing era. They could transmit something that was of importance. Maybe some of them, had a coming of age post World War II, but there was a lot of, pushback during that period. There was something to really transmit. But that has not been happening at all in terms of the politics. Remember, we got the Great Society out of basically an assassination of a president, and also I think more because of what Lydia was speaking to earlier. In Newark, there were guns on the table, right? In Harlem, there were guns on the table. Watts was ready to burn. So you had something called the Great Society that came out of that as well. That was much better than the quote New Deal or what we're getting today in terms of all these proposals. So we're living in this very regressed space, really in place. And how do we think from that is really again a question that I think Stiegler is posing, but I'm not so sure if it's at the adequate.
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's important to keep this in mind that he's not saying that I mean, he's basically saying we've failed. We're part of a failure. And I like the term. I'm writing something on techniques of servitude, and I'm using the phrase the archaeology of a failure, which is the post 68 generation that we have really gone through.
So I'm trying to put together
into certain ones. Black Lives Matter. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, you froze for a minute. I'm just trying to put together an arc of the concepts.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
There's regression, and there's shock, and there's the maturation. There's the enlightenment, maturing of children to adults, adolescents to adults. Not quite sure exactly. He seems to be talking about universities, so adolescent to adult. Maturation seems to be what the majority means. So there's a philosophy of education. There's a philosophy of production, and I feel like I'm missing a piece, maybe because I only read the beginning and the end. But there's something about that education piece that seems incredibly self-destructive. So is the only thing to gain from 1968 that you failed as a parent? Is that really what he's trying to tell us? Is he communicating?
No, it's nicely put the way you put it, and I think
that's what I got.
Yeah, I see. Okay, all right.
I got from 25 to 41. That's what I got, and I didn't actually get a program of education that accomplishes enlightenment. I only learned that the clash of the generations is necessary for growth. And I want to know what's the difference. My overarching question is, what's the difference between the clash and shock? So there's something combative about a clash. What makes that healthy? As opposed to, or what's the difference between that and a shock? And is actually a revolution not more shock than clash? I don't know. Growth?
Well, I think first of all, to your final proposition or question, is revolution not a shock? I'm not so sure about that, the way that shock and shock therapy and shock economics and disaster capitalism have been used in this is about. It could be traumatic, in a way, but the thing about trauma is you need trauma for meaning, right? And that to experience this, going back to the mourning and melancholy, the petit abjecta, all of these things seem to me to be absolutely necessary if we're going to come over to the other side here. I think what Stiegler is doing here is very much like Freud in Mourning and Melancholy, and that the left always has a problem with mourning the lost possibilities, right? And cannot get on with things, right? And in a way, that there's kind of a generalized nostalgia. In my nomadic existence the last month, because I can't get into my, place in Montreal, I have learned through times in the Woodstock, Socrates area, there's nothing but nostalgia for 60s rock and roll and, et cetera. All anybody talks about is the band or whatever, or, what went on. I mean, of course, they're somewhat future oriented, but you can just tell underneath this, when we talked about this last week, there is nothing that's really futurely oriented in terms of culture and where we go. So I think that Stiegler also, he understands this, this very well going forward. As terms of what you say, failed parents, I mean, that's great. In a way, yes, I mean, we don't learn unless we fall, right, in a certain way. So failure is not the worst thing in the world. I guess the question in maturation, are we learning anything from it, right? Are we learning anything from the failure? I mean, we continue to go to the polls. I would suspect, I mean, I'm not being, I would suspect on the left that at least 50% of the left that carries a Marxist banner is going to go vote for Joe Biden in November. They'll do that if they actually win. But they will do this. What are we here? I mean, in a sense, are we reduced to this rational choice that this is all we're getting, etc.? About this. I mean, I know I'm putting a lot of my own reading into this and as an implied reader, but at the same time, I don't think he's really just saying that, it's a generation that failed. I think he's really asking us in terms of this enlightenment, what can we really learn? What is this Epimethian moment about, right? What do we learn from techniques? What can we use here in order not to bridge the gap, but the chasm, not, we used to, when I'm going, the generation gap. He doesn't use this. He uses the clash, right? As you say, right, in a way. And so I think again for him, he's trying to keep open this dialectic, between disenchantment, failure, right, versus that of a kind of re-enchantment, of where we can start taking a step out of this symbolic misery. I mean, you probably know, Lydia, better than all of us, the clinical data on the levels of depression out there right now, the levels of, child, depression, use of pharmacological drugs or whatever, psychotropic drugs to control things, etc. And of course, that doesn't begin to touch the surface of adult problems. So this is again a thing where the misery is so active in so many ways that he's, again, I mean, there is something about he wants this care to come back in. So that I think the verb to care, right, in the Heideggerian sense, in a Zorga, very deep sense, not only of concern, but it's care that shapes us, right? This is what he's looking for. I think that, when Josh talked about the forms out there and what's manifesting itself, is this really based on care? Or is it just reaction to a really, awful, oppressive, intolerable situation? So I just want to, I mean, just some very quick, impressionable thoughts here,
I mean, I'd say too, Michael, that the difference between, shock and clash is that the clash is that dialectical overcoming. It's that it implies growth and movement and an outward extension, whereas the shock arrests development ultimately.
Yes. Right.
It stops that growth. I mean, I think that that's really what he's talking about, and I think that that's the way he's posing it in terms of Aufklärung too.
Yeah.
That you need that, negation of what you thought was the right, framework to get to the next level, to get to the next,
Right. Yeah, I think Josh puts it very well that what we've been witnessing again in any kind of counter-revolutionary moment, and I'm using that term very loosely, but obviously, the late 60s and early 70s, everything from, the COINTELPRO against the Panthers and the American Indian movement and many other groups, et cetera, the beginning of charging for education. CUNY was free until 1970 1946. You know, you didn't pay anything to go. You know, people didn't go into strapling debt in the 70s. You know, et cetera. You know, all of these moments, in a way, arrested something along the way. This was part of the shock doctrine. You know, make it real. You know, be real. This kind of, you know, slogan. Let's be be real about things. And you know, and when you think about disaster capitalism and the Chicago Boys, the shock therapy was to, you know, do exactly what we're looking at in the United States. You know, make the economic gap much greater and greater, where the control of wealth is so much at the top, and you know, there is no policy that's really out there to give you know, a new you know, chance to a good majority of the people, or a chance to really even survive at this point in some ways. So I think he's also bemoaning this. To go back to the Kantian thing about maturity, the maturity is really about not needing a guardian, not having, you know, to be able to develop enough autonomy and serenity. And this is where the generation failed, you know, going back to what you were saying, Lydia, that we really failed, if you will, in terms of building autonomy in the next generation to be able to think on its own feet. Even though there's an expert entrepreneurial class that has emerged, you know, the billionaire Zuckerberg types, right? Etc. Right? We know this, right? We've seen this. But is that maturity in a way? Or is that just the ability with mathematical reasoning, determining a market, finding this out? I mean, one of the things that was an indication to me is at Yale Business School, instead of people going to classes in literature, by 1973, the most popular course was David Geffen, then of Electra Asylum. He wasn't David Geffen of today, but then of Electra Asylum's How to Succeed in Business, in the recording business. That was the most sought after class around. To me, this was an indication. Then the business schools came in, you know, as the model. Everybody, no longer the best and the brightest, would not go to you know, a graduate school in philosophy or literature or in anthropology, et cetera, in the humanities, but started to go to business schools. I want to be an investment banker. Polling Princeton students, what do you want to be? Over 50%. I want to be an investment banker. So how does this, how right, of a general, in a sense, with those ideas? I mean, I think this is a very interesting question that he's posing here, right? How do we get to this algorithmic governmentality then through, against, in Marxist terms, an associated world of producers and a struggle for, you know, some kind of fishing in the morning, poetizing at night, etc. And in Stiegler's terms, the associated milieu of an economy of contributions. You know, how do we get there in the midst of all of this? So I think that's part of the problematic. And going back to Black Lives Matter, is this a rebellion? Is it a reaction? Or is it really an event that is, you know, going to create a new clash, right? Or does it become one of those shocks to the system that can be absorbed very quickly, like Occupy was? I mean, these are real questions, and I'm not trying to frame it only in either or. I think it's both and, but it's worth thinking about, because I don't think the gung-ho that this is a great awakening event and there's all this potential in it is the only way to go. On the other hand, to negate it and not think of it thing. Yeah, please, Andy. Yeah.
Oh, sure. I was just going to build on what you're saying, is that one thing I would note is look at something like 200 of the Fortune 500 companies have made statements in support of Black Lives Matter and putting in a black square in their Twitter feed and so on. Yeah. And so how can this be if a movement that you would think, well, a movement that's toppling statues and so on, and maybe some of the people are engaging in, you know, violence or rioting, you know, not maybe the movement itself, but you know, how can this be something that corporate America would be congenial to? And the thing I would point out is that there's not the movement itself. They're not calling for the type of redistributive justice or labor solidarity or any of these things that the left historically called for. It's they want more representation on corporate boards. They want changes to university curricula. It's sort of a call for sort of procedural reform within the system as it stands, rather than being any kind of radical rethinking of the role of citizen and state or something like that. So.
This speaks again, to my mind, of the failure of the generation. To go back where Lydia started this, it was it's not only the parents' failure. I think it's a failure that reformism is much easier, and what you're talking about, procedural, reform, is really what's at stake here. We can make you a millionaire too. You have a seat at the table. Right? This is really the rhetoric that's going on in so many ways. Yes. Oh, we've got to support this, this black funded, film, thing. We need more Spike Lees. That's what they're going to say. Who's by no means a Marxist or radical, in my opinion. Yeah.
I don't get the sense it's monolithic. I mean, I get the sense it's somewhat. That there are different tensions within Black Lives Matter, and some of them are more radical than others. I think if I wanted to speak to what disappoints me, it's less to do with Black Lives Matter than the way you could say the energy from it has been channeled towards kind of an making everything about personal psychology. In other words, that we should examine our use of language rather than reform institutions. This contrast. Again, that C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, who wrote Slavery and Capitalism, both agree that the economic system precedes racism. Racism is a kind of justification for a particular system. So but it's like all the emphasis is on the psychology, which I agree has a place, but still there isn't enough focus on the institutions. And I going back to the Greeks, Cornelius Castoriadis would point out that there was no such thing as the Athenian constitution. The Greek is the constitution of the Athenians. In other words, it wasn't about elections. It was about something that you were involved with inventing and changing, and if need be, throwing it out and starting again. Right. And there's some of that energy I find in Black Lives Matter, but I do think it's, there's also this tremendous attempt for the corporate, world to. You ever seen like a tree? If you hammer a sign on it, and then 25 years the tree eats the sign, well, which is really amazing thing if you.
Yeah. The Fortune 500 operation.
It's kind of like that. There's this possibility.
Right. Yeah.
But there's this possibility with Black Lives Matter. But the question is whether it's just going to be reabsorbed.
Right. So, I think you raised something, and Tony Negre is actually great at this in his book Insurgencies in English, but it really means a constitutive power and constituted power, and how does one really build this power, of constituted power? How does that really come from the constituency? And I think this dialectic is always worth considering, because what you're referring to, Richard, at least in Negre's sense, is the institutions and how constituted power works, right, in a way. And the change, it's not on the drawing board, again, the changing of the institutions. You're right. It's not the language we use, the statues that are still up. All of these things are the target areas rather than, quote, even the radical reform, right? Much less the revolutionary overturning of this, into a new shape and new form. How do you create new forms out of this? So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's like in climate struggles, if you will, or wrestling with climate change. Everybody's go pay 5 cents for the bags now.
Exactly.
You can't get plastic bags in certain countries, right, at all to take out. Instead of, confronting fossil fuels and carboniferous capitalism more directly, and change that institutional culture, this is really it. Yeah, 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 yeah. And John just wrote, thanks, Michael, cosmetics. I like that. I feel like I'm
Yeah, if we would all
a
just use
graduate.
paper
It's good.
straws.
Yeah, yeah, right, right. Yes, indeed. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is part of the problem again. I mean, the long march through the institutions, and I'm going back just like Lydia did with Newark and this compelling moment, the compelling moments in the '60s, and if you will, for the generation that maybe failed, is that to change the system from within in the long march of through the institution was too long and too reformist. And look where it got everybody. Leonard Cohen. They sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within. There's a lot of wisdom in that. There was 20 years of boredom. I mean, 40 years of boredom, as our friend Peter Bratza says, is what we've been through in this neoliberal epoch. In a way, which is another thing that Stiegler addresses later with malaise and boredom, etc. The guy does cover the waterfront, I got to say. He might not leave us completely satisfied, but he does take on a lot of the most prevalent issues. So yeah, I mean, this seems to be the real. I don't know how other people feel about this or think about this, but it seems to me that the issue really here is Black Lives Matter. That event and the COVID-19 that really begins to take down the institutions or becomes a full massive, critique of the institutions and what will happen. Right? Right? Yeah, 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 yeah. Okay. And yeah, Cornell says Uncle Tom change. Yeah, it ain't gonna happen. You're right. Right. I see the chat again. If we can play off of that. But I'm interested in other people to say. I mean, I know many people, many years who you say, oh, you're not going to do it from the outside. You can't really build the political formation from the outside. We have to work within. And then, of course, the standard message of working within the Democratic Party. You see where that gets you? That gets you not even Bernie Sanders at the table, much less revolutionaries. I mean, this is what we've proven. It's even worse in 2020, than it was in 2016 within the Democratic Party. To my mind, this is what I'm seeing. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, but I think
Yeah.
that's also a failure of the system to absorb. If they had been able to absorb Bernie Sanders, I think it would have been a success for them. But they're unable to do that. I mean, they're the only thing they're putting out there is kind of a senile old gentleman who can barely put two sentences together. And, he's hiding out in his basement until Donald Trump, self-destructs. That's kind of where we are politically here. So I don't know, I mean, I don't think we're certainly not at a rupture, but I think we are at kind of a meltdown.
We're in an interrupture.
Yeah.
There's no question about that in any way.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But I think we are seeing kind of a systemic meltdown.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Andy just made a good comment in the chat. Who are the leaders? That's another thing too. When in Black leadership, there were leaders during the very articulate people, spokespeople for Black militancy. The question is, who are those leaders today? And I'm interested to hear because I don't know. I mean, I know some of the people, but where is the quote intellect, et cetera? Where is the passion beyond that of we've been fucked over for so long. We're, and the generalized discourse on the police and police brutality. So that's another question. I mean, I grew again. I went to hear Kunstler argue on behalf of Rap Brown. Rap Brown knew shit. I mean, he had a mind at work. These people read all the time. You used to go to prison to get educated in some ways. It's interesting. We're doing a piece on the 99 books in George Jackson's cell. This was a guy that never, I don't think George Jackson finished high school, certainly didn't go to university. Yeah. So, I mean, this to me is a very interesting question. Where are the leaders? And where, to me, again, and I think to Stiegler and certainly to Derrida and Lacan, where are and Althusser, which really was the beginning of this, the processes of articulation, because without those processes of articulation, we're fighting, shadow boxing in many ways, to my mind. So I'm kind of interested in some thoughts about that. If you see leadership, or is it just a horizontal movement? And I'm not so sure about those either. In some ways, can there really be at this level that direct democracy, given what we have? Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't think any leadership has emerged at this point.
Yeah.
I think everything is more or less still in formation, and we may not see it for a year or two, or maybe even longer.
Okay, so I just posted some links about very clear policy articulations, platform articulations that are 50% economic, 50% institutional change, and a biography of the three founders of the movement who are activists who are of a new generation, who do gender justice and art as their primary introductions into the sphere. And I think that I'm witnessing right here a clash of generations, or a refusal of an old wisdom of what is here right in front of your face, well articulated, well defined, with a definitive leadership. So what are you talking about?
Okay. I'm going to read the piece. I'm going to read it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And it's in the chat. You did it? Yeah.
Yeah, you could Google it. Black Lives Matter founders.
I see it. Yeah. I see it here. Yeah.
Including trans women.
Right.
And there's a platform of the Movement for Black Lives. A chart's right there. It's a pie graph. It identifies reparations and divestment, and fully 50% of it seems to be economic in base, heading toward widespread reform, community power, political, etc.
Can people hear me now?
Yes.
I want to say that, kind of following Lydia, I want to say that there are many, and it's not just the young people, there are many African-American thinkers and activists that maybe were, schooled in the 60s, that are also older, that are speaking to and trying to form coalitions by which systemic change could unfold, right? And so I think there isn't a lack of intellectual power or kind of radical aspiration within the Black movement. I don't think so at all. I think, if anything, the Black movement's more exciting than any other movement. But I just want to say at this moment, a problem that I've been just wrestling with is what are going to, what's going to bring the energy to the point where all of these different interests and coalitions can actually come together. And another way of phrasing the question would be, what would initiate the rupture? But it's not just the rupture. I mean, obviously, if things get bad enough, maybe things haven't even gotten bad enough yet. But once the rupture is initiated, what's going to make it possible for a quote, in the broadest sense, left to fill the vacuum, let's say, as opposed to the fascists? You know, is there a kind of, I mean, I think Michael, I think you're speaking to, you know, Stiegler's kind of theorizing a possibility, but I want to ask, you know, yeah, I don't think there's any dearth of radical thought or intention. I just think it's like, what would initiate the rupture and then make it possible to actually bring in a transformed institutional set, let's say?
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think there's a lot of promise in Black Lives Matter. I'll go back to something also that Todd McGowan said, talking about the left and making this argument that the left is really about universality, and that identity politics is in fact always right wing, though it's not spoken of that way. But it's about, you know, belonging to some group. It takes the empty space of subjectivity and ties it to a particular identity in a way. And that one of the things that he points out with that universality is in some ways about claiming rights for those who do not belong. You know, whether it's the immigrant, for example, illegal immigrant, but it's constantly, in other words, and it's not about inclusiveness, you know, not at all. It's about a certain kind of universality, which is about non-belonging, and that the way in which Black Lives Matter has kind of worked to bring people together around, you know, those who are marginalized, killed, and, you know, to have people say, I can't breathe, for example, you know, that this, or don't shoot. You know, his argument that this brings the universality of the left into play. And you know, I don't know, I mean, you know, we can argue about that theoretically, but it is interesting to me, just, you know, because again, I've spent a little time, because of Dan Georgiakis, thinking about, you know, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and, you know, they really wanted to bring in, they felt they needed to bring in a wide coalition that they didn't have. And it was a real tension. Some of them were really in the factories and said, this is a waste of our goddamn time. And others were saying, no, you know, make your movies, publish the, you know, have your reading groups. You know, we need to have a broad coalition. And what you do see with Black Lives Matter is a broad coalition. It's not, you know, it's not just a particular group of African Americans. They may be, in many senses, leading and at the catalyst, but you see a wide group of young people kind of drawn into it. So it does have something promising, which, you know, you know, yeah. As these things go, you can't get too optimistic given the past, but nevertheless, I still think there's some pretty interesting potential there.
And also, I just want to say, you know, if you're a Black person, I mean, you can't blame a Black person for simply not even being able to see ahead of, like, you know, hey, what? I just don't want to get pulled over by the cops and murdered or lynched. You know, I mean, and so I feel like maybe what's called, yes, this embodiment of a culture of care. So if the left wants to be part of the conversation in a way, you know, in a broader sense, well, yeah, I mean, we have to be sympathetic, not maybe to the most radical project, but to, like, you know, I just want to stay alive, you know, like to make space for that.
And also the possibility, you know, again, that Nietzsche piece about, you know, the tearing down of the monuments, I find sometimes, you know, way simplistic, you know, especially when you go back again to C.L.R. James and, you know, who in an article about Stokely Carmichael will praise Jefferson, you know, And, you know, Stokely Carmichael, of course, was one of the major figures of Black Power. And in talking about the Haitian Revolution, not by chance calls it the Black Jacobins, because he says, look, they take their model, their language, their structure, their whole notion of universality from the French Revolution and fulfill it in a way that the French don't. But, you know, he also says at the same time that the French were slave owners. They made the money, the revolution, the French Revolution. So it's not about the good guys and the bad guys. And there is something about tearing down of these statues that seems to me at times kind of simplistic and reductionist. However, you know, if we are starting a moment of critical history, which, you know, if we really get people to think about history and really talk about history, you know, if we tear down a good number of these monuments and like say, well, or debate them, you know, if we really start to think about history, ooh, that could be interesting.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, Michael, I just wanted to mention that
Yeah, sure.
the politics of care is not care, and then you could elucidate this a little more. It's not care in terms of caritas, like the Christian notion.
No, it's not about charity, or nor is it about liberal hand-wringing, or, you know, the poor blacks, et cetera, et cetera.
But it's more to the Heideggerian, what is it called, fable of care.
Yeah, it's how one shapes and how one molds and how one lives in terms of the underlying structure of being. It is not a quote, just a racial determination, or, you know, having to do with that, you know, in terms of Black Lives Matter. All lives should matter. And I think I mentioned this again, you know, we've gone from linguistically, in terms of linguistic capital, if you want to think of it this way. And again, we've gone from Black Power to a biological term that lives matter. I know the police have brought this on. I know that the policing of neighborhoods, the way that all of this has happened in a sense, but, you know, this is the code that's being put out there in a certain way. And of course, what does that set up on the other side in simple Aristotelian, you know, oppositional thinking? Well, white lives matter too. So you get the chance on the other side. So you're in this either or framework instead of the both and that you're in the pharmacon, where the remedy and the poison are both working together, instead of, you know, that you could really move in a dialectic. So it gets stuck again, at least in my mind. I mean, I'm not saying that this is gospel or whatever, but at least what I've witnessed over the years, you get into this arrested dialectic, right, that stays at the level of identity, right, that stays at that level and doesn't, as you, Andrew, said, get into a much larger thing for the left, right, in a way, or it becomes more of an upsurge, if you will. I don't think rupture is planned. I think it happens, right? The Bolshevik, the events in history that Badiou refers to, they happen. It's a happening. You know, it's not something that is planned or whatever. You can plan strategically, economic plans, you know, platforms, all these kind of things, but ultimately the brakes have to be there. And again, I just want to, you know, I mean, I know it's getting late, but I just want to point out the last part of the Stiegler thing. Here, if on page 219, you know, is kind of a nice summary of this notion of care in the states of shock on inner science, intergeneration, and university autonomy. He says, in the new global industrial context, this carelessness and neglect have allowed the abandonment of any politics. And I just want to insert here for a second, you know, we have lived through, you know, now at least 25, 30 years of student debt that has gotten to astronomical proportions, you know, a warming of the planet without any kind of structural reforms, much less, you know, overthrow of carboniferous or, you know, fossil fuel capitalism. You know, we have lived through this without any activity at all. So we have to ask the question, where have we been? You know, going back to this notion of failure and the inability to transmit to generations. But anyway, I'll read this out. Okay. And practice of the attention of youth as Europeans, and this is Stiegler taking up Husserl, and Husserl was criticized for this for being Eurocentric, but he is Eurocentric, and so was Karl Marx, in certain ways, and Sigmund Freud and others. But anyway, and hence as heirs to a history that gave birth both to the Greek idea of logos and to its transformation by the first industrial societies in England, France, and in Germany, then the whole of Europe, and passing through Protestantism. The outcome today is violently anti-European sentiment. I think this is very, very real, in some ways, what he's doing here. European construction has been experienced by Europeans as the destruction of the processes of collective individuation. And I know, I guess Hugo's still here, maybe he's just, but anyway, as the destruction of the processes of collective individuation that have hitherto engendered them as Europeans in a proliferation of forms and types. So then he goes to his own work. In Taking Care of Youth, and again, page 219, section 83, I have attempted to show that this is a matter of abandoning new generations and that the pharmacology of the mass media has made its main goal the replacement of the intergenerational transmission of prescriptions. The replacement of the intergenerational transmission of prescriptions. Such prescriptions in which the entry into civility always consists are replaced by the control of behavior, constantly transformed by marketing, and via its main carriers, the productions of the program industries. It is thus thought itself that will have been destroyed, and I think this is what we're witnessing more and more as time goes on, natively, intergenerationally, such as the horizon of Diotima's statement to Socrates explaining what it means to gain knowledge, namely to let a younger individual take the place of an older one. This is why national and continental disintegration accelerated by European carelessness has generated an intergenerational disintegration and inevitably used European culture into decadence. Now, I'm not agreeing that we should be Eurocentric, but most of us are formed by, quote unquote, ideas of the Enlightenment. We're all kind of children of that moment in some ways. And I'm not so sure I agree with, that we should not think about, there's a great line by the German filmmaker Wim Wenders back in the early 70s. The Yanks have colonized our unconscious, right? The Americanization of the world, right, and based on an absorption of Europeanization, seems to be one of the major enemies in terms of culture and its transmission, how this Americanization took place. So I just want to leave, this open, this question of care. What does it really mean, in a sense, right? Does it lead to a new kind of, as Josh was saying, Christian charity, of where the liberal left picks it up, right, and says we've got to, have this notion of caritas and, the giving back, that, reparations is not thought through, and I've had these discussions with Cornel West. I mean, we've talked about reparations should not be in the form of a cash payment to all families. In a sense, it might be about education, that free education and getting a start in the world might be a better thing that's institutionally enforced than just, cash payments. We've had a little bit of these discussions. So anyway, I want to just problematize this because I think this is important. Not that I'm a follower of Stiegler on this point only, but I do think at the base is this care, right? Care is got to be in the equation. And it just doesn't mean I care for your brother or I feel your pain, right? Or I can identify how oppressed you were. I think it's much deeper than that.
Yes. Yes.
That's really where we should be thinking, in a way. And I'm one to say alongside Heidegger, and I mean, I'm no Heidegger. I mean, but in a sense that we have not yet begun to think. And that seems to me to be the real question going forward. How do we think this beyond the categories in which we have been forced to think, in many ways? Or what Josh was saying, again, the radical imagination or the revolutionary imagination is always overturning categories, right? Always overturning programs. The critique of the Gotha program being a great example of this, when Marx takes on, utopian socialism and Lamarckian socialism, in the 1870s, after the Paris Commune, in a way. So I think it's very important to keep this in mind, again, based on this group that's, introduction to the work of Bernard Stiegler and beyond, or whatever you want to do with it. So for me. So anyway, some other people before we close up. I mean, some thoughts about this. I mean, I thought this was very productive, and yeah, in many ways, yeah.
I just wanted to ask what we should look at for next week.
Well, I thought I put out the Symbolic Misery, the section there. Okay. Let me see. I have it in my notes. The schedule. Yeah, but I thought we could, we can continue on these themes. What I would like to do is maybe give more of a modeling of proletarianization and grammatization and the role of memory, and to go back to William Estrade's no longer here, but about supports too, that he speaks about early on in the reading of The Lost Spirit of Capitalism. So in a way, look, I'm just going back to where Lydia started this a while ago about the failure of a generation and the failure as parents. I think Stiegler's, again, looking at both remedy and poison here, and he's also talking about how the programming industries, right, and the replacement of this intergenerational thing, transmission has really killed us, right, in a way. The section I just read, not that I, find this to be the best conclusion, but I think it's very insightful of where he's going. But let me just see what I had in terms of the reading for next week. I think it's the Symbolic Misery section, to get more into psychic and collective individuation. So I'll send out something about that. Again, again, where we began tonight in terms of how the process of individuation is also disrupted and delayed is another good question to go back to. I think it's I don't have it in my yeah, here it is. Okay, I think I have it now. No, I don't.
Do we have Symbolic Misery?
I think it was sent out as an attachment, right? I think Matt, is Matt here still?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
Let me see if I can post it in the chat.
Yeah, I sent it out, but then, so I sent it out yesterday, but that ended up conflicting with what you had me sent out this morning. So the reading.
Oh, it did? Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. Okay,
so like,
no problem.
what I sent out yesterday is not what we ended up.
Yeah, okay, this is what I have, though. The last one is the economy of care objection, but I don't have the readings on this. Yeah, Symbolic Misery, it's only 13 pages. The idea is really to look at psychic materialism and psychic and collective individuation. Again, this is on the control of affects, how affect is controlled. So that would be for next week, and be, I think, a very interesting topic to talk about. What is to be done, and in this context, right? So maybe we'll get what is to be done, and then it's up to you guys if you want to continue. But I'm, whatever you like. This is spirited, and I'm glad we have, some differing perspectives. It's great, that's what it's about, in a way. Clash instead of getting stuck in some ways, yeah.
Matt, I didn't see an attachment yesterday.
There wasn't an attachment? I think Matt sent out all the attachments.
No, so I sent them out initially. I just didn't want to bombard people with.
Okay, you didn't want to bombard again, right? Okay.
No, because then
next week should be interesting because it is kind of, in some ways, the remedy, or the beginning of a remedy, if you will. We could talk about that, if there is such a thing, right? Without the poison, but it is more prescriptive. It's also more based on ethos, right, than, his criticism of everything else. But again, I suggest to you, I don't know how deep you want to go, he doesn't mention Julia Kristeva at all in here. He excludes, you know, some of the Catherine Malibu and others, right? But he does, you know, go through the Deleuze, Derrida, Marx, Hegel, you know, in his approach. And the critique of the Frankfurt School, I think, is quite good, you know, in a way. And you know, he also
I'm
has an
sending it
ongoing
now.
critique on Marcuse too, right? Right. So yeah, yeah. So it's only 13, but the book is, you know, Symbolic Misery is a very, I have it here.
Yeah, yeah, I just sent it in the chat, I think.
It has a terrible cover, a terrible cover in English.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The French edition is so much better, yeah, but this is the English edition. Yeah, terrible cover, but yeah, and it's called Symbolic. Volume One. It's the Volume One of the Decadence of Industrial Societies. You know, so this is Volume One of a 4-volume. The Hyper Industrial Epoch is the moment here, right? So you have an age of grammatization, 3 ages, and then you have the epoch now of hyper-industrialization. For Heidegger, the 3 epochs of being are being as the one, as in the classical world, and in classical philosophy, the thinking of the one and the many in Greek philosophy. Secondly, being as nature in the Latin and the Roman period. And the third period is being as self-consciousness, where we still are, right? We haven't gotten outside yet of self-consciousness. And this is the advent of philosophical modernity. So these 3 epochs are where we're living. And Heidegger, the 4th epoch, is this switch from self-consciousness to the technological in some ways, but never really articulates it fully. But that is the Heideggerian turn in which technology becomes determinate, if you will, right? Techne. There's no longer, you know, any kind of mediation anymore of self-consciousness, right? So we're outside of the closure of the history of philosophy. I mean, I really wish. See, the thing I don't like about Zoom is I could map this on a blackboard, you know, and you know, at least give you some, you know, points of reference. But you know, Hegel was the culmination of philosophy for Heidegger. It ended in self-consciousness. Now it's the end of philosophy and the task of thinking. So Stiegler is, again, taking his point of departure from that, you know, very, very much so. So for him, the epoch, the new epoch, in the post-structuralist epoch, is also the hyper-industrial epoch. And he's trying to work within the Heideggerian transition from self-consciousness to, you know, the technological epoch, or the epoch of techne, right? Or really the epoch, maybe even better, to solve the epoch of the framework, right? The epoch of the Gestalt, the reserve stock and the framework might be another important part to this. So we can discuss this, but the hyper-industrial, like I said, this is a 4 or 5 volume projected study. This is the introduction to it, about how affects are controlled, right? In a way. And if you're interested in buying it, it's a great chapter. I mean, it's in the book anyway that Matt set out. Allegory of the anthill. You know, instead of the allegory of the cave, or the, you know, the allegory of the bee, the Mandevilles on the bees, you know, you have the allegory of the anthill here. And it's interesting, too, how he rewrites allegory from that point of view. So it's very creative, too, in terms of some of the stuff. And then he has a reading of a film. I don't know if anybody knows the work of Bernard. I think it's a Bonello. You know, he did some interesting films. Bertrand Bonello, I'm sorry. Tiresias and the War of Time. You know, Tiresias, of course, being the great blind soothsayer in Sophocles. You know, the one that tells Oedipus what he did, tells Antigone, tells Creon what's going to happen to him, etc. Tiresias being, you know, the interpreter, the great interpreter, soothsayer. So this is interesting. And then there's a whole thing on the revolutionary arsenal. So again, I'm only assigning 13 pages because we can only do so much, you know, in a short period of time. But the book itself is worth perusing. And I'm very sorry that they have such a bad cover here. This looks like we're lined up to wait for Symbolic Misery and watch the latest rock show or something in beautiful, you know, nature. You know, I mean, we're not Republicans, but anyway, yeah, yeah. So I'll see if I can find. If I'm in Montreal, I might have the copy of the French edition I can show you. If not, I'll be restricted to the English here. So thank you, everybody. You know, appreciate it. Have a good week, and see you next week on the 20th, I guess it is, of July. Hopefully from beautiful Montreal, cooler than New York.
Is this our last? Would that be our last session?
Oh, it's up to you guys. I'm interested in continuing if you are. Yeah, it's up to you. If you guys want to, it's fine with me. I don't mind. Yeah. There's a lot of work to be done and a lot of things to be discussed and a lot of practices to be enacted. So, yeah.
So I don't see you next week. I might not make it. I'm interested in continuing.
Okay, we'll keep you on the list, of course. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liddy. Bye-bye. Okay, thank you, Andy, for your participation.
Bye, guys. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. And
talk to you soon, Michael.
Everybody. Okay, Josh, I'll be in touch.
All right.
Leslie.